Hello and welcome to the African Regional Conference 2016. I'm James King, the Banker's Africa and Middle East editor, and I'm joined now by Terence McNamee with the Brenthurst Foundation. Terence, thanks so much for joining us today. Now, we're halfway through the first day. We've had the key speaker talk about issues around financial inclusion, and we've heard some issues also around sort of economic development across the continent. So let's take a moment now to look at issues of political risk and political stability. To what extent have discussions around those concepts changed in the last couple of years?
Well, Africa is somewhat of a paradox in that the continent as a whole has never been more peaceful if you measure that in terms of bottom line number of civilians and number of soldiers who are killed in conflict. Africa has never been more peaceful, but at the same time, levels of political volatility across the continent are pervasive. I can hardly think of even 3 or 4 countries that are not threatened by some form or combination of transnational organized crime, extremist violence, refugee crisis, and so forth. So it's this paradox of, on the one hand, huge gains have been made in terms of establishing security, but these are fragile gains and they could be reversed.
Okay, and so do you see that the outlook for the next year or two is set to remain the same, or do you see a more positive trend moving forward?
Well, I think if we look at hard security, there's no doubt that the asymmetric attacks by non-state actors that we've seen in Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire, in Kenya and other countries, I think that's probably set to intensify. Just like globally, security experts believe that the problem of extremist violence is going to worsen before it gets better. And the big concern in the African context is right now it's largely isolated to sort of a band that stretches from Somalia in the east of the continent up to Morocco in the northwest. However, the concern is that some of that insecurity is going to hemorrhage, spill over borders, spill over borders and go southward.
Okay, now Terence, you've also argued in the past that when it comes to regional integration projects, sometimes the rhetoric can be more advanced than the reality on the ground. What's the basis for that argument?
Well, I would just give 2 examples that have been in the press just in the past few days. If you're a huge consumer company like ShopRite in South Africa and you're moving a truck full of goods from South Africa to Zambia, let's say. Reports suggest that that truck, that haulier, will need something like 1,600 documents just to move those goods from South Africa to Zambia. And another example that was recently cited was from the cement mogul in Nigeria, Dangote, who is Africa's richest man. He recently said that if he was to operate in say all 54 of Africa's countries in a year, he would need 35 visas. Now that's extraordinary if you consider that if you were British or Canadian or American, you would need far less visas to operate as a businessman or woman across the continent. So that's a sort of real world example of the problems of our lack of integration.
And that obviously feeds into this narrative of Africans investing in Africa and obviously constitutes one of the main challenges, I guess, in that field.
Absolutely. So there is a lot of rhetoric about Pan-Africanness and Pan-African solidarity. But the reality is that historically African countries have not been very comfortable with non-national firms operating within their borders. And we see that, for instance, in the South Africa-Nigeria example. South Africa being the great exception with its companies spread out across the continent, but you'll find very few, say, Nigerian firms or Kenyan firms operating in South Africa.
Well, Terence, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure.